I never thought I'd be the woman who discovers her husband's affair through financial statements. But there I was, staring at our joint account, suddenly understanding why our retirement fund had mysteriously shrunk by 6 figures. The Four Seasons, hotel charges, the Tiffany Co purchases, the first-class tickets to Paris when he told me he was at a conference in Chicago. What James didn't realize when he drained our savings was that he had awakened something in me I'd kept dormant through 15 years of marriage. The financial prodigy who'd been managing his family's trust fund in secret for the past decade. This is the story of how my husband's betrayal led me to reclaim not just my money, but my power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, saved something extra special for you. Olivia, darling, you wouldn't believe the portfolio adjustments I made this quarter, James announced, swirling his bourbon as our dinner guests nodded appreciatively. The tech sector's volatility presented some unique opportunities. I smiled, demurely from my seat at our mahogany dining table, surrounded by Boston's financial elite, James's colleagues and their spouses. Our Beacon Hill townhouse glowed with soft light from the crystal chandelier overhead, a home I had researched, negotiated, and secured, while James took credit for the investment. You married a genius, Olivia, remarked Stephen from Wellington Management, raising his glass. How he found that emerging markets fund before anyone else had it on their radar is beyond me. If only they knew that I had suggested that very fund during one of our pillow talks, explaining its potential based on economic indicators I'd been tracking. James had dismissed it initially, then presented the idea as his own at work the following week. I'm just grateful he explains everything to me, I replied with practiced humility. Finance has always been a challenge for me. Across the table, Diana Palmer, our family wealth manager, caught my eye with the slightest arch of her eyebrow. She alone knew the truth, that I held an MBA from Wharton, had worked briefly at Goldman Sachs before meeting James, and for the past 10 years had been the shadow manager of the Blackwood Family Trust, James's family fortune that he believed was handled solely by the firm. Women generally prefer security over growth, James said with paternal authority, his hand finding my shoulder. That's why Olivia lets me handle all our investments. Diana coughed slightly into her napkin, and I suppressed a smile. The irony was almost comical. James had nearly crashed his family's legacy during the 2008 recession with a series of impulsive investments. His father, sensing disaster, had secretly approached me after discovering my financial background. We struck a deal. I would manage the trust behind the scenes, and in exchange, Richard Blackwood ensured I was named as co-trustee with powers that James knew nothing about. The trust had grown 286% under my management. James believed it was the work of faceless advisors at the family office. How's the new beach house coming along? Asked Patricia, Stephen's wife, as the server cleared our entree plates. Renovations are almost complete, James answered before I could speak. The contractor wanted to go over budget, but I negotiated him down. It's all about being firm with these people. Another lie. I had spent hours poring over the contractor's estimates, finding mathematical errors and researching material costs to bring the price down by nearly 30%. James had been golfing when I finalized the deal. Later, after our guests departed and the catering staff packed up their equipment, I found myself alone in our master bathroom, staring at my reflection as I removed my earrings. At 42, I still maintained the athletic build from my college. Swimming days, though fine lines had begun to frame my green eyes. My chestnut hair, now streaked with subtle highlights, fell just below my shoulders. I hardly recognized the woman who stared back at me, this carefully curated version of Olivia Blackwood, the supportive, financially naive wife who existed solely in the shadow of her husband's supposed brilliance. "Great evening," James said, appearing in the doorway, loosening his tie. Stephen might move his personal account to our team after tonight. "That's wonderful," I replied, applying my nighttime moisturizer. "You were very persuasive." He moved behind me, hands finding my waist. "We make a good team. You charm the wives, I handle the business." I smiled at his reflection, wondering what he would say if he knew I had spent that morning on a conference call with the managers of the Blackwood Trust, redirecting $10 million into an emerging biotech fund that would likely double within 18 months. "By the way," James continued, now moving toward our bedroom, "I've transferred some money from our joint savings for a new investment opportunity. Too complicated to explain, but trust me, it's going to be big." My hand paused on my face. "How much did you transfer?" "Just about 200,000, he replied casually, as if mentioning he'd bought coffee. "Sometimes you have to move quickly on these opportunities." 200,000. From our joint account, money I had contributed to equally throughout our marriage, carefully allocating my consultant income, actually my management fee from the trust, to build our retirement fund. "That's a significant amount," I said, carefully. "What kind of investment is it?" "It's a private equity thing," he answered vaguely. "Through a contact at the club. Don't worry your pretty head about it." "Don't worry your pretty head," his favorite dismissal whenever I asked about our finances. In the mirror, I watched something flicker across my expression, a momentary crack in the mask I had worn for so long. "I see," I said softly. "Well, I'm sure you know what you're doing." Later that night, with James snoring beside me, I opened my laptop and logged into our joint accounts. The transfer had been made 3 days ago, $212,000 to an account I didn't recognize. Unusual, since James typically moved money into his brokerage account for investments. Banking on his assumption that I never checked our finances, he hadn't even tried to disguise the transfer. I noted the account number, closed my laptop, and stared at the ceiling. Something felt wrong, and it wasn't just the missing money. James had been increasingly absent over the past few months, late nights at the office, weekend client meetings, a sudden increase in business trips. My mind flashed to the receipt I'd found in his jacket pocket last week, an expensive restaurant I'd never heard of, with charges for 2 of everything. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind calculating more than just financial figures. The next morning, I dropped James at the airport for a quick business trip to New York, then drove straight to my private office downtown. Officially, I worked as a part-time financial consultant for select clients, a cover story that explained my income while maintaining the fiction that I wasn't seriously career-focused. In reality, this space served as my command center for managing the Blackwood Trust and my own investments. "Morning, Olivia," greeted Megan, my assistant who was actually a brilliant financial analyst I'd poached from State Street. "Diana Palmer called. She wants to know if you're still meeting her for lunch." "Confirm it," I replied, settling at my desk. "And I need you to trace an account number discreetly." Megan raised an eyebrow but asked no questions, one of the reasons I valued her. By noon, when I met Diana at an upscale bistro in the financial district, Megan had traced the account. The money had already been moved again, split into multiple transfers over the past 3 days. "You look troubled," Diana observed as our salads arrived. At 58, with her silver bob and impeccable pantsuits, Diana had the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades seeing through people's financial facades. "James moved over 200,000 from our joint savings," I explained. "The story doesn't add up." Diana set down her fork. "This isn't the first unusual movement I've noticed." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "He tried to access information about the trust last month, asking questions about liquidity and distribution terms. When I mentioned that any changes required your approval as co-trustee, he seemed surprised, then backtracked. The implications sent a chill through me. Why would James suddenly be interested in liquidity options for the trust? And why withdraw such a large sum from our joint savings when he had access to his own considerable funds? Has there been any unusual activity in his personal accounts? I asked. Diana hesitated. Client confidentiality. Diana, please. You've known me for 15 years. She sighed. There have been significant cash withdrawals over the past 4 months. Luxury purchases. A lease on a downtown apartment under his personal account, not the firm's. An apartment I knew nothing about. My fork clattered against the plate. Olivia, Diana said gently, I think it's time you conducted a thorough audit of your joint finances. That afternoon, I canceled my remaining meetings and began a systematic review of our accounts. The picture that emerged turned my initial concern into something colder and more defined. For at least 6 months, James had been systematically withdrawing funds from our joint accounts, making large purchases that couldn't be explained by business expenses, and recently, he had begun inquiring about liquidity options for assets we held together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was the credit card statements that confirmed my suspicions. The Four Seasons charges spanning months, always the same room category, jewelry purchases, restaurant bills with wine selections I knew weren't to his taste. First-class tickets? To Paris when he had told me he was at a conference in Chicago. The evidence was undeniable. James wasn't just having an affair, he was financing a lavish lifestyle for someone using our joint savings. I sat back in my chair, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across my office. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of carefully maintaining the illusion of the supportive, financially dependent wife while secretly managing millions. 15 years of stroking his ego, letting him take credit for my ideas, my work, my financial acumen. And now this betrayal, not just of our marriage vows, but of our financial partnership. He had taken money I had earned, saved, and contributed to spend on another woman. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Meetings running long. Staying overnight in NY. Don't wait up. I checked the location sharing we had enabled on our phones. He wasn't in New York. He was in Boston, specifically in the luxury apartment building near the public garden that Diana had mentioned. A strange calm settled over me as the final pieces clicked into place. The mask I had worn for so long, of the agreeable, financially naive wife, had become so convincing that James believed it completely. He thought I would never check our accounts, never question his explanations, never discover his betrayal. His underestimation of me would be his downfall. I picked up my phone and called the one person who had known the real me even before I became Olivia Blackwood. Caroline? It's Olivia. I need your legal expertise. Caroline Evans had been my roommate at Wharton and was now a partner specializing in high-net-worth divorce cases at one of Boston's top law firms. Something's happened, and I need to understand my options. That evening, instead of returning to our Beacon Hill townhouse, I checked into a hotel under my maiden name and began to formulate a plan. James had no idea that while he thought he was depleting our savings for his affair, he was about to discover the truth. That his comfortable lifestyle, his career success, and even his family's wealth had been quietly managed and protected by the very woman he had betrayed. The trust fund he believed was managed by faceless advisors had actually been preserved and grown by me. The investment insights he boasted about to colleagues had originated from my analysis. The financial security he took for granted, and now jeopardized with his reckless behavior, existed because of my expertise. As I opened my laptop and began documenting every suspicious transaction, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of stepping fully into my power. No more hiding my intelligence, no more downplaying my financial savvy, no more letting James take credit for my achievements. My husband had used our life savings to fund his affair, believing his financially naive wife would never know the difference. He was about to discover just how catastrophically he had misjudged the woman he married, and the true extent of the power she wielded over his financial future. The morning light filtered through the hotel curtains as I reviewed the notes I'd made throughout a mostly sleepless night. My laptop screen displayed a meticulously organized spreadsheet documenting every suspicious transaction from our joint accounts over the past 6 months. The pattern was undeniable. Over $430,000 had vanished from our shared savings and investment accounts, all withdrawn or transferred by James. The $212,000 transfer was just the latest and largest movement. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Meetings went well. Flying back this afternoon. Dinner tonight?" I stared at the message, noting the casual tone, as if nothing were amiss. As if he hadn't spent the night in a secret apartment with another woman while pretending to be in New York. As if he hadn't systematically drained our joint savings to finance his double life. I typed a response designed to maintain normalcy. "Sounds good. I'll make reservations at Sorellina." His favorite Italian restaurant, expensive, exclusive, and public enough that he would maintain his composure regardless of what I might say. Setting my phone down, I opened my secure email and sent a message to Richard Blackwood, James's father, and the original founder of the trust I managed. "Need to meet urgently. Usual place. Noon today." At 78, Richard had largely withdrawn from public life after a mild stroke 5 years earlier, but his mind remained sharp. Our arrangement had begun as a business transaction. He needed someone he trusted to manage the family wealth when he realized James was making risky decisions, and I needed leverage in a marriage where I had willingly but increasingly regrettably sublimated my own professional identity. Over time, however, our relationship had evolved into something almost paternal. I showered and dressed in a tailored navy suit, applied makeup carefully to hide my exhaustion, and headed to my office. Megan looked up in surprise when I walked in. I usually worked from home on Thursdays. "Change of plans," I explained. "I need everything we have on the Blackwood Trust's current structure and liquidity options. Also, prepare transfer documents for my personal assets." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Everything all right?" "It will be," I replied, with more confidence than I felt. "Also, I need a comprehensive background check on someone, discreetly." "Name?" I showed her a photograph on my phone. A woman with a cascade of blonde hair standing next to James, her hand possessively on his arm. I had found it buried in his cloud storage while checking for financial documents, dated just 2 weeks ago at a charity gala I had been too busy to attend. According to the event photos, her name is Vanessa Reeves. Megan took notes. "Timeline?" "Yesterday," I said. At 11:30, I left the office and drove to the Cambridge retirement community where Richard now lived. Despite the Blackwood fortune, he had chosen a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a high-end senior living facility near Harvard, where he had once taught economics before building his investment firm. Richard was waiting on his small balcony, a chessboard set up on the table between 2 comfortable chairs. Our usual place. We had played hundreds of games over the past decade, discussing investment strategies and family matters over pawns and knights. "Olivia," he greeted me, not rising. The stroke had left him with a permanent limp that wounded his pride more than his mobility. "Your message sounded urgent." I sat across from him, suddenly uncertain how to begin. Richard had always respected me for my financial acumen and straightforwardness. Now I needed to tell him his son was betraying not just me, but potentially the family legacy we had worked to preserve. "James is having an affair," I said finally, deciding directness was best. "And he's using significant assets to fund it, including draining our joint savings." Richard's weathered face remained impassive, but his hand trembled slightly as he moved a pawn forward to begin our game. "How much?" Over $400,000 from our joint accounts in the past 6 months. And he's been asking Diana about liquidity options for the trust. Richard's eyes, still sharp in his lined face, met mine. You believe he intends to access the trust to continue financing this indiscretion? I believe he's preparing for a scenario where I discover the affair and he needs independent assets, I replied, countering his opening move. The problem is, he doesn't know I'm aware of how extensively he's already depleted our shared resources. Or that you control those very trust assets he thinks will be his safety net, Richard added, a hint of his old shrewdness returning to his expression. What do you intend to do? I captured one of his pawns. First, protect myself financially. James believes I'm financially dependent on him, but I've maintained separate accounts he knows nothing about. Second, I need to understand the extent of his betrayal before deciding next steps. Richard studied the board. And if the betrayal extends beyond the personal, if he's made promises or commitments using family assets he doesn't actually control? The question struck at the heart of my concern. James's position at Blackwood Financial was largely ceremonial. He was the face of the family business, attending meetings and events, while the actual investment decisions were made by a team that reported to me through channels he didn't know existed. But his name and signature still carried weight. He could make commitments that would be difficult to unwind. That's why I need your help, I said. I need to understand every agreement, contract, or commitment James has made in the past year. That involves family assets. Richard nodded slowly. I'll speak with Edward. Edward Hayes had been the Blackwood family attorney for 3 decades. But Olivia, there's something else you should know. His tone made me look up from the chessboard. James asked me about changing the trust structure last month. He suggested that having you as co-trustee was unnecessary since you, and I, quote, don't really understand the financial complexities involved. The words stung, even though they aligned perfectly with the persona I had cultivated. What did you tell him? A ghost of a smile crossed Richard's face. I told him I'd consider it after reviewing the trust's performance over the past decade. I thought it might be educational for him to see exactly how well your financial naivety has served our family. And did he review the performance reports? He scheduled a meeting, then canceled, twice. Richard moved his bishop. Check. I blocked his attack with a knight and considered my next move, both on the board and in my rapidly evolving plan. I need copies of those performance reports, and I need to ensure James cannot make any significant changes to the trust structure without extensive review. Already done, Richard assured me. After his inquiries, I had Edward implement additional safeguards. Nothing changes without both your signature and mine. He paused. What about this woman? Do you know anything about her? Vanessa Reeves. I'm having her background checked now. Richard captured my knight. When will you confront him? I studied the board, seeing 3 moves ahead to an inevitable conclusion. Not until I have all the pieces in place. James has underestimated me for 15 years. I'm going to let him continue doing so until it's too late for him to counter. By the time I left Richard's apartment, having lost the chess game but gained a stronger ally, Megan had already sent an initial report on Vanessa Reeves to my secure email. 36 years old, 7 years younger than me, former model, turned lifestyle consultant. 3 previous relationships with wealthy married men, each ending with substantial settlements or property transfers. Currently leasing a luxury apartment in the building Diana had identified, with James listed as the guarantor on the lease. I pulled my car into a parking garage near Newberry Street and made a call to Caroline. I need to meet today, I said. When she answered, I have documentation of financial impropriety that may affect how we proceed. My office, 3 o'clock, she replied without hesitation. Caroline's corner office at Morrison & Bennett occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise with views of Boston Harbor. We had known each other since our first day at Wharton when we were paired as roommates. She, the daughter of a Minnesota schoolteacher with a full scholarship. Me, a California tech executive's child with something to prove to a father who thought finance was men's work. We had supported each other through breaking glass ceilings, relationship disasters, and professional triumphs. "This is worse than I thought," Caroline said now, reviewing the financial documentation I'd presented. Her sleek bob swung forward as she leaned over the papers spread across her desk. "He's not just funding a lifestyle. He's transferring assets systematically. These patterns suggest planning, not just impulsive spending." "He's preparing to leave," I said, voicing the conclusion I'd reached during my drive from Cambridge. Caroline nodded. "The question is whether he's planning to leave you for her, or if she's just the current entertainment while he establishes independent financial footing. Does it matter? Either way, he's betrayed our marriage and misappropriated shared assets. It matters for strategy," Caroline replied, tapping a manicured nail against a document showing the apartment lease. "If he's genuinely attached to her, he'll be emotional and potentially careless. If she's incidental to his larger financial scheme, he'll be more calculated." She looked up at me. "What outcome are you seeking here, Olivia? Revenge? Maximum financial security? A quiet, dignified exit?" The question caught me off guard. Until this moment, I had been focused entirely on uncovering the extent of James's betrayal and protecting myself. I hadn't fully considered what endgame I wanted. "I want recognition," I said finally. "For 15 years, I've allowed James to dismiss my intelligence, take credit for my work, and believe I was financially dependent on him. I want him and everyone else to understand exactly who and what I am." Caroline's expression softened slightly. "That's about pride, not money." "It's about truth," I countered. "And yes, I want financial justice too. He's spent our joint savings, money I earned and contributed, on another woman. I want those assets returned at minimum." "And the trust? His family money?" I hesitated. Despite James's betrayal, I had built a relationship with Richard and felt genuine responsibility for the Blackwood legacy. "I won't weaponize the trust unless absolutely necessary. That's not about James. It's about my commitment to Richard." Caroline nodded, making notes. "Here's what we need to do immediately. First, secure all documentation of your contributions to joint assets. Second, freeze any remaining joint accounts to prevent further dissipation. Third, document the timeline of his affair alongside the financial withdrawals to establish clear correlation. And if he realizes I'm onto him? Then we accelerate," she replied simply. "But Olivia, there's something else we should consider." She slid a document across the desk, a bank statement showing a transfer of $75,000 from James's personal account to a law firm, specifically to Vincent Morgan, one of Boston's most aggressive divorce attorneys. My stomach dropped. When was this? 2 weeks ago. Not only was James having an affair and draining our joint assets, but he had already retained divorce counsel. This wasn't just preparation. This was active, planning for separation. "He's going to try to control the narrative," Caroline said. "Make it about irreconcilable differences or growing apart. Position himself as the reasonable party who tried to make it work. While hiding the affair and the financial impropriety," I added, anger replacing shock. "Exactly. So we need to decide. Do we confront this head on, or let him think he's in control while we build our case?" The answer came to me immediately. Let him think he's winning. It's what he expects. That I'll be emotional, reactive, and financially illiterate when confronted with divorce. Those expectations give us room to maneuver. Caroline smiled, the same smile I remembered from when she'd outmaneuvered an overconfident study group partner who'd tried to take credit for her work during our MBA program. "That's the Olivia Chen I remember." I raised an eyebrow. I haven't been Chen in 15 years. Maybe it's time to reclaim a bit of her, Caroline suggested. The woman who graduated top of our class and had 3 job offers before finals were even over. On the drive to meet James for dinner, I thought about Caroline's words. Olivia Chen had been ambitious, outspoken, and unapologetically brilliant. She had never pretended to be less than she was to make a man feel important. Somewhere in the careful construction of my marriage, I had locked that woman away. Soralina was busy when I arrived. The Thursday evening crowd, a mix of financial district executives, wealthy Beacon Hill residents, and special occasion diners. James was already seated at our usual table near the window, studying the wine list, with the serious expression he reserved for such important decisions. "Darling," he greeted me, standing to kiss my cheek. He looked refreshed and confident in a tailored gray suit, not a man who had spent the previous night with his mistress and the day plotting to divorce his wife. "How was your day?" "Enlightening," I replied truthfully, taking my seat. "Yours? How was New York?" Not a flicker of discomfort crossed his face at the lie. "Productive. The Carlyle Group is considering bringing their full portfolio to us." Another fabrication, I knew from my morning review of Blackwood Financial's prospect list that the Carlyle Group had declined a meeting just last week. "That's wonderful," I said, mirroring his easy falsehood with one of my own. "You must be pleased." The waiter appeared, and James ordered an expensive Barolo without consulting me, though he knew I preferred white wine. A small but telling reminder of how accustomed he was to making decisions for both of us. "I thought we might discuss summer plans," he said after the wine was poured. "I'm thinking of taking some extended time off, maybe renting a place in the south of France for a month or 2. My heart rate quickened, though I kept my expression neutral. A summer rental in France would require significant capital he had likely already set aside from our depleted savings. Was he planning to take Vanessa there? Or was this his way of suggesting a trial separation? "France sounds lovely," I replied, "though I'm surprised you could step away from work for that long." "The team can handle things," he said dismissively. "And frankly, I've been thinking we need more balance, less focus on work, more on enjoying the wealth we've accumulated." The wealth I've grown, I thought, recalling how I'd increased the Blackwood Trust by 286% during my tenure as secret manager, while James had nearly crashed it in 2008. "That's an interesting shift in perspective," I noted. "You've always been so career-focused." He shrugged, sampling the wine with exaggerated appreciation. "Priorities change. Life is short." Apparently, his priorities had changed to include a blonde former model and exclusive use of our joint savings. "Speaking of finances," I ventured carefully, "I noticed a rather large withdrawal from our joint account. The retirement fund?" James paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. The first sign of tension. "Did you? I didn't realize you checked those accounts." "Just happened to notice when I was looking for a tax document," I lied, matching his casual tone. 200,000 is significant, even for us." He recovered quickly, his expression relaxing into patronizing reassurance. "Just a temporary reallocation for an investment opportunity. It'll be back in the account with healthy returns. Before you know it." He reached across the table to pat my hand. "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." "Of course," I said, withdrawing my hand to reach for my wine glass. "I was just curious." His relief was palpable. The naive, trusting wife was behaving exactly as expected. "Let me worry about the finances, darling. That's my domain, remember?" "How could I forget?" I murmured, thinking of the meeting I'd scheduled for the following morning with the head of emerging markets at the investment bank, where I secretly directed a significant portion of the Blackwood Trust assets. The rest of dinner proceeded with excruciating normalcy. James dominated the conversation as usual, explaining his insights on market trends as if translating complex concepts for a child, while I nodded appreciatively and asked appropriately simplistic questions. All the while, I was cataloging each condescension, each dismissal, adding them to the mental ledger of a debt that would soon come due. When the check arrived, James placed his platinum card on the leather folder without looking at the total. "I thought I might need to work late tomorrow," he mentioned. "Don't wait up if I'm not home for dinner." "Another client meeting?" I asked innocently. "Budget reviews for Q3, he replied smoothly. "Mind-numbing but necessary." I smiled, thinking of the text I'd received from Megan during dinner, confirming that James had reserved a table for two at an exclusive restaurant overlooking the harbor for the following evening. "I understand. I have some charity committee work to keep me busy anyway." As we drove home separately, I had told him I'd come from a lunch meeting near the restaurant. I called Megan from my car. "I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon," I instructed. "And contact Edward Hayes. I want to review every document James has signed in the past year." "Already done," Megan replied. "Mr. Hayes will meet you at your office at 2, and the background report on Ms. Reeves is complete. You'll want to review it immediately." "That comprehensive?" "Let's just say your husband isn't the first. Blackwood she's been involved with." The revelation stopped me short. "Explain." "She had a brief relationship with James's cousin William about 3 years ago. It ended when he discovered she was still married to a real estate developer in Miami. The divorce proceeded quickly after that, with a settlement that included a Manhattan condo and substantial alimony. The pieces were rearranging themselves. In my mind, she targets wealthy families. Systematically, Megan confirmed. The full report is in your encrypted folder. When I arrived at our townhouse, James was already upstairs in his study. I could hear him on the phone, his voice too low to make out the words. Instead of interrupting, I went to our bedroom and prepared for bed with methodical precision, removing my makeup, applying my usual skincare routine, changing into silk pajamas, maintaining the facade of normalcy while my mind processed the day's revelations. James was planning to divorce me. He had retained counsel, systematically drained our joint assets, and was involved with a woman who specialized in extracting wealth from exactly his type of man. Meanwhile, he continued to lie effortlessly about everything from his whereabouts to our finances. As I lay in bed, pretending to read while waiting for James to join me, I reflected on the strange calm that had settled over me. There was pain, certainly. 15 years of marriage didn't dissolve without grief, regardless of circumstances. But beneath the hurt lay something stronger: resolve. James had made a critical error in his calculations. He believed he held all, the financial power in our relationship, that his betrayal would leave me devastated and dependent. He had no idea that the woman he'd been systematically underestimating for 15 years had been 10 steps ahead of him all along. When he finally came to bed, smelling faintly of the scotch he kept in his study, I set my book aside and turned toward him. "Everything okay?" I asked. "You were on the phone for quite a while." "Just work," he replied, not meeting my eyes, as he removed his watch. "The Johannesburg exchange is causing concerns." Another lie: the Blackwood Trust had divested from South African markets months ago on my recommendation. "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner," I ventured, "about taking time in France this summer." I paused. "It might be good for us to reconnect." James glanced at me, a flicker of something, guilt, annoyance, crossing his face, before his expression settled into careful neutrality. "Absolutely. That's exactly what I was thinking." "We've been so busy with our separate lives lately," I continued, watching him closely. "It feels like we're drifting." He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to me. "Work has been demanding, for both of us." "Your work, maybe," I said, injecting a hint of wistfulness into my tone. My consulting is hardly demanding. James turned, his expression softening into the condescending affection I had grown to despise. You know I appreciate your little business. It keeps you engaged, gives you purpose. My little business, the hobby that had not only generated substantial independent income for me, but had served as cover for my management of his family's 9-figure trust. It does, I agreed mildly. Though sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed on a more serious career track like before we met. He chuckled, patting my leg through the covers. You weren't cut out for that high-pressure world, Liv. You're too sensitive, too people-oriented. Trust me, you're much happier now. The breathtaking confidence with which he defined my capabilities and happiness, as if he knew me better than I knew myself, would have infuriated me just 24 hours earlier. Tonight, it merely strengthened my resolve. You're probably right, I murmured. You usually are about these things. Satisfied that his worldview remained unchallenged, James finished his bedtime routine and slid under the covers beside me. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep, the untroubled rest of a man who believed himself firmly in control of his destiny. I lay awake beside him, mentally reviewing my plan for the coming days. Tomorrow, I would meet with Edward Hayes to understand exactly what commitments James had made using family resources. I would need to secure my separate assets, document the extent of his financial betrayal, and prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come. But first, I needed to understand Vanessa Reeves better, not just her history with wealthy men, but her current expectations regarding James. Was she a knowing participant in his deception, or merely an opportunist taking advantage of what was offered? And more importantly, what exactly had James promised her? I slipped quietly from bed and retrieved my phone from my purse, taking it into our ensuite bathroom. 3 new messages waited in my secure email account. Detailed financial records from Diana showing James's personal account activity for the past year. Confirmation from Richard that he had instructed Edward to provide me with complete access to all Blackwood family legal documents. And most interestingly, a message from Megan with the subject line, V. Reeves Social Media, private account. I opened the last email to find screenshots from a private Instagram account belonging to Vanessa. Megan had gained access through channels I preferred not to know about. The most recent post, dated just this morning, showed a close-up of a woman's hand bearing a substantial diamond ring with the caption, "When he promises forever. Blessed, shuttered new beginnings." My blood ran cold. The timing, combined with everything else I had learned, suggested an unmistakable conclusion. James wasn't just having an affair. He had proposed to his mistress, likely using funds from our joint savings to purchase the ring. The betrayal was complete, and so was my determination to ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions. I returned to bed, lying beside the man who had shared my life for 15 years, the man who now planned to discard me while helping himself to the financial resources I had helped build. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought provided comfort. James had no idea that the trust fund he believed would cushion his new life was entirely under my control. When he discovered that truth, the look on his face would almost be worth the pain he had caused. Almost. Morning light streamed through the bathroom window as I applied my makeup with practiced precision. James had already left for the office, or so he claimed, by the time I emerged from the shower. His hasty departure spared us the charade of morning conversation, though he had left a note propped against the coffee maker. Early meeting with Henderson Group. Don't forget charity gala next Thursday. Love, Jay. The Henderson Group, another fiction. I knew from yesterday's conversation with Edward Hayes that the only significant meeting at Blackwood Financial today was with regulators regarding compliance protocols, a meeting James routinely avoided by claiming other commitments. I poured coffee into a travel mug, reflecting on the Instagram post I'd discovered last night. The diamond ring, the promise of forever. The audacity was breathtaking. While systematically draining our joint assets and preparing divorce papers, James was simultaneously building a future with Vanessa Reeves, likely promising her the financial security he intended to deny me. At 9 sharp, I arrived at my downtown office to find Megan already waiting with a thick folder of documents. "Everything from Edward Hayes," she confirmed as I set down my bag. Plus updated financial statements from Diana Palmer showing all Blackwood Trust activity for the past 3 months. "And our secure accounts? Fully documented and transferred to the new holding structure as you requested. The offshore setup is complete, Gibraltar and Cayman, with the Singapore contingency ready if needed." I had never expected to need the financial escape routes I'd quietly established over the years. Like an emergency kit stored in case of disaster, I had created a network of secure accounts, investments, and offshore structures, all legally sound but completely insulated from James's reach. The original motivation had been caution after observing how quickly the 2008 financial crisis had nearly wiped out the Blackwood family fortune. But now these preparations would serve a different purpose. "What about the apartment surveillance?" I asked, referring to the luxurious downtown unit where James had installed Vanessa. Megan handed me a slim flash drive. "Exterior camera footage confirming James's presence on the dates you specified, plus entry and exit logs from the building. Security system." The concierge is remarkably chatty when properly incentivized. He confirmed that Mr. Blackwood is a frequent visitor, usually arriving late evening and departing early morning. I nodded, slipping the drive into my purse. Documentation was crucial, not just for any potential legal proceedings, but for the confrontation I knew was coming. James would deny, minimize, and attempt to rewrite history. Physical evidence would be my shield against his manipulation. "One more thing," Megan added, her expression shifting to something I rarely saw: concern. The investigations team found something unusual in Vanessa Reeves's background. Before changing her name 5 years ago, she was Vanessa Reynolds. The name triggered a distant memory. Why is that significant? Because 12 years ago, Reynolds was briefly engaged to Thomas Hawthorne. My blood chilled. Thomas Hawthorne had been James's closest friend and business associate before his suicide 3 years ago, a tragedy that had shaken the Boston financial community. Thomas had lost millions in a failed investment venture, his reputation destroyed by allegations of misappropriated client funds. James had publicly distanced himself from the scandal, claiming he had been unaware of his friend's financial improprieties. Are you suggesting James knew Vanessa before her current incarnation? Megan spread several photographs on my desk, grainy images from society pages dated a decade earlier. In one, a younger James stood smiling beside Thomas Hawthorne at a charity event. In the background, barely in frame but unmistakably present, was Vanessa. "They've known each other for years," I murmured, the implications rearranging my understanding of the situation. This wasn't a recent infatuation or midlife crisis. This was something more calculated, more deliberate. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. 10:30 a.m. meeting with Victor Yang, head of emerging markets at Crown Investment Bank, and my primary contact for managing significant portions of the Blackwood Trust. I gathered the documents Megan had prepared, sliding them into my leather portfolio. "I'll be back by noon," I told her. "In the meantime, I need everything you can find on Thomas Hawthorne's final investments, particularly any connection to accounts James might have controlled." The headquarters of Crown Investment Bank occupied 20 floors of a gleaming tower in Boston's financial district. I had been coming here at least monthly for almost a decade, yet never once mentioned these visits to James. As far as he knew, I occasionally consulted on women in finance initiatives, a convenient cover that played perfectly into his perception of me as superficially connected to the financial world without any real expertise or influence. The receptionist greeted me by name. Good morning, Ms. Chen, using my maiden name as I had always requested for these meetings. Victor was waiting in his corner office, rising to greet me with the respect accorded to someone who controlled investment decisions for a 9-figure trust. Olivia, always a pleasure, he said, gesturing to the sitting area where financial reports were already arranged on the coffee table. I've prepared the analysis of the Southeast Asian technology sector you requested. Victor was one of the few people who knew me as I truly was, a financial strategist with razor-sharp instincts and the authority to move tens of millions with a single decision. He had never questioned why my management of the Blackwood Trust required discretion, accepting my explanation that family dynamics necessitated certain arrangements. For the next hour, we discussed potential investments, market projections, and reallocation strategies. I authorized a significant position in an emerging semiconductor manufacturer and reduced exposure to European markets experiencing political instability. There's one other matter, I said as our meeting concluded. I need a comprehensive audit of all Blackwood Trust transactions for the past 2 years, with particular attention to any anomalies, withdrawals, transfers, or attempted access from unauthorized parties. Victor's expression remained professional, but I caught the slight raise of his eyebrow. This is outside our normal review schedule. Should I be concerned about security breaches? Just due diligence, I replied, maintaining a neutral tone. Recent market volatility suggests a more cautious approach. He nodded, understanding that my reference to market volatility might encompass circumstances beyond financial indicators. I'll have my team prepare the audit immediately, with highest confidentiality protocols. Thank you. And Victor, if anyone from Blackwood Financial contacts you directly, including James Blackwood, please refer them to me before disclosing any information. His eyes widened slightly at the explicit mention of James, but he nodded. Of course, all trust communications go through you exclusively, as always. As I left Crown Investment Bank, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from Diana, Palmer, and a text message. Call immediately. James attempting to liquidate personal investment accounts. I ducked into a nearby coffee shop and dialed Diana's number, finding a quiet corner away from the morning rush of customers. What exactly is happening? I asked without preamble when she answered. James called this morning requesting immediate liquidation of his personal investment portfolio, approximately $8 million in assets, Diana explained, her voice pitched, low as if concerned about being overheard. He specified wire transfer to an account I don't recognize, with an unusual routing number. Offshore? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Cayman Islands, Diana confirmed. When I explained the regulatory holding period for international transfers of that size, he became agitated, insisted it was urgent. The pattern was becoming clearer. James was accelerating his timeline, moving assets beyond reach before initiating divorce proceedings. The engagement ring for Vanessa wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a signal that they were entering the next phase of whatever plan they had concocted. What did you tell him? I asked. That the compliance team would need to review and approve, which typically takes 3 business days, Diana replied. I've flagged the request for additional verification, which buys us more time. But Olivia, he's the named account holder. Legally, I can only delay so long. Understood. Proceed with normal verification protocols, but don't complete the transfer until you hear from me again. I paused, considering my next move. And Diana? Thank you. I know this puts you in a difficult position professionally. Not as difficult? As you might think, she responded, a hint of steel entering her voice. Financial irregularities of this nature trigger automatic internal reviews. I'm simply following procedure. After ending the call, I sat for a moment, clutching my coffee cup as I processed this latest development. James was moving faster than I had anticipated. The question was whether his acceleration was motivated by growing attachment to Vanessa, financial desperation, or something else entirely. perhaps awareness that his deception had been discovered. My phone buzzed with a text from Megan. Found Hawthorne connection. Time sensitive. Office ASAP. 20 minutes later, I was looking at financial records spread across my desk, trying to absorb their implications. Megan had discovered that Thomas Hawthorne's failed investment venture, the one that had ultimately led to his suicide, had been primarily focused on Central African mining operations. The same mining operations that appeared in the Blackwood Trust's investment history from 9 years ago, investments I had divested shortly after taking over management of the trust due to their questionable returns and ethical concerns. James used Thomas as a front, I said slowly, piecing it together. The high-risk investments weren't Thomas's idea at all. Megan nodded. And look at the timing of the trust's divestiture from these holdings compared to when Thomas's company began, increasing their position. The pattern was unmistakable. As I had systematically removed these investments from the Blackwood Trust portfolio, Thomas's firm had acquired increasingly larger stakes, as if someone were using Thomas's company to maintain exposure to these assets while appearing to honor the trust's new investment direction. James was backdoor investing, I murmured, using his friendship with Thomas to maintain positions in these companies even after I directed the trust to divest. And when those investments collapsed, Thomas took the fall, I finished grimly, both financially and publicly. The magnitude of James's betrayal expanded before me, not just marital infidelity and financial deception toward me, but a years-long pattern of manipulation that had potentially contributed to his friend's destruction. Had Thomas discovered James's machinations before his death? Had that discovery played a role in his suicide? And what role had Vanessa played in all this? Her presence in those old photographs couldn't be coincidental. Had she known Thomas through James? Or James through Thomas? Either way, their current relationship had roots far deeper than a chance meeting or recent affair. My phone rang. Caroline Evans, my attorney friend. "I've reviewed everything you sent," she said when I answered. "Olivia, this goes beyond the typical dissipation of marital assets. There's a pattern here that suggests premeditated financial fraud. I'm discovering that James's deceptions run deeper than either of us initially thought," I replied, glancing at the Hawthorne documents. "How quickly can we move to protect my interests?" "I've already prepared emergency motions to freeze the joint accounts pending equitable distribution. We can file as soon as you're ready to formally commence proceedings." The decisive moment had arrived sooner than I'd expected. Once legal proceedings began, there would be no maintaining the facade of normalcy. James would know that I had discovered his betrayal, and whatever plan he was executing would accelerate accordingly. Not yet, I decided. I need 48 hours to secure certain assets and information. 48 hours gives him time to hide more money, Caroline warned. Or reveal where it's already hidden, I countered. He believes I'm completely in the dark. That gives me an advantage I'm not ready to surrender. After ending the call, I turned to Megan. "We need to move up our timeline. Contact Richard Blackwood and request an emergency meeting of the Trust's Oversight Committee for tomorrow morning. Then get me everything you can find on Vanessa's activities during the period surrounding Thomas Hawthorne's financial collapse and death." As Megan left to make arrangements, I opened my laptop and began composing an email to Edward Hayes, requesting specific amendments to the Blackwood Trust's operational protocols, changes that would further restrict access and require additional verification for any significant transactions. Richard had already approved these measures in principle. Now we needed to implement them immediately. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Running late tonight. Don't wait up." The casual deception, so routine he probably didn't even consider it lying anymore, strengthened my resolve. I replied with a single word. Understood. By late afternoon, I had completed my preparations for the Trust Committee meeting and was reviewing the additional information Megan had compiled on Vanessa Reeves. Her connection to Thomas Hawthorne appeared more substantial than initially evident. They had been engaged for nearly 6 months before abruptly separating, approximately 3 months before his financial troubles became public. More disturbing was the series of financial transactions Megan had uncovered, large transfers from Thomas to Vanessa in the weeks before their separation, followed by a pattern of account closures and asset movements that suggested she had been extracting wealth while planning her exit. "She did to Thomas what she's helping James do to me," I murmured, seeing the parallel tactics with disturbing clarity. My office phone rang, the direct line that only a few people had access to. The caller ID displayed, "Blackwood Residence." "Hello, Richard," I answered, assuming it was my father-in-law. "Olivia." The voice that responded was female, elegant, with the slight patrician accent of old Boston money. Ellen Blackwood, James's mother and Richard's wife of 52 years. "Ellen," I said, surprised. In 15 years of marriage, my mother-in-law had maintained polite but distant relations with me, treating me with the cool courtesy one might extend to a business associate rather than family. "This is unexpected." "I imagine so," she replied. "I've just spoken with Richard about your meeting tomorrow. I'll be attending as well." My surprise deepened. Ellen had historically shown little interest in the family's financial affairs, content to focus on her charitable work and social obligations. "I wasn't aware you were involved with trust oversight." "I wasn't," she acknowledged. "But recent developments suggest it's time I took a more active role." "What developments exactly?" I asked carefully. A pause, then. "Richard has shared some of your concerns regarding James's financial activities. I have additional information you should be aware of before tomorrow's meeting. Information about Vanessa Reeves." My pulse quickened. "You know her?" "Not personally," Ellen replied, "but I remember the circumstances surrounding Thomas Hawthorne's death quite clearly. Richard believes you should hear what I know before proceeding further." We arranged to meet privately before the committee gathering the following morning. As I ended the call, I felt the pieces rearranging once again. Ellen Blackwood's unexpected involvement added a new dimension to an already complex situation. My desk phone rang again almost immediately. "Ms. Chen?" My receptionist rarely used my maiden name unless the caller had specifically asked for me by that name. "There's a Vincent Morgan on line 2, asking to speak with you urgently." Vincent Morgan, James's divorce attorney, according to the bank statements Caroline had shown me. Why would he be calling me directly? Had James already initiated proceedings? "Put him through," I instructed, quickly activating the call recording feature on my office phone system. "Ms. Blackwood," Morgan began without preamble when I answered, his voice carrying the polished authority of Boston's legal elite. "I'm calling regarding a sensitive matter concerning your husband." "I'm listening," I replied neutrally. "I understand you've been making inquiries into certain financial transactions involving jointly held assets," he continued. "While I appreciate your concern, I must advise you that these actions could be construed as interference with legitimate business operations." So James had discovered some of my investigative efforts. Not surprising given the network of financial professionals who might have alerted him to unusual account reviews or document requests. What was surprising was his attorney's aggressive approach, contacting me directly rather than proceeding through formal channels. "I wasn't aware that reviewing my own financial information constituted interference, Mr. Morgan," I responded, keeping my tone even. "Perhaps you could clarify exactly which inquiries have caused concern?" He cleared his throat, seemingly taken aback by my composure. "Mrs. Blackwood, my client has expressed concern that these actions may destabilize sensitive business negotiations currently underway. He asked me to reach out informally in hopes of avoiding unnecessary complications." "How considerate," I remarked, unable to completely suppress the edge in my voice. "And does your informal outreach extend to explaining why my husband has been systematically removing funds from our joint accounts while consulting divorce counsel?" A pause, then, "I think this conversation would be better continued with respective legal representation present." "I agree completely," I replied. "You can direct all further communications to Caroline Evans at Morrison & Bennett. I believe you're familiar with her work in high net worth dissolution cases." Morgan's sharp intake of breath confirmed he recognized Caroline's name, and her reputation for aggressive, meticulous representation of clients facing financially complex divorces. "Mrs. Blackwood," he tried again, his tone shifting to something more conciliatory. "I think there may be some misunderstanding here. Mr. Blackwood has expressed only the highest regard for your marriage. These financial adjustments are purely administrative." "Mr. Morgan," I interrupted, "let's dispense with the pretense. You deposited a $75,000 retainer from my husband 2 weeks ago. The same week, he transferred $212,000 from our joint savings to an account connected to his mistress's apartment lease. I have documentation of both transactions, along with a comprehensive accounting of all marital assets he's diverted over the past 6 months." Silence stretched across the line. "As I said," I continued into the void, "please direct all further communications through Caroline Evans. Good day, Mr. Morgan." I hung up, my heart racing despite my outwardly calm demeanor during the call. The direct confrontation with James's attorney marked a point of no return. There would be no maintaining the illusion of normalcy now. Events were accelerating toward inevitable collision. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. James called again about liquidation, became hostile when told of compliance delay, demanded to speak with senior management. I texted back, "Maintain position, senior management." Aware and supportive. Almost immediately, my phone rang. James himself. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then decided direct engagement might reveal useful information about his current state of mind. "Hello, James," I answered, injecting warmth into my voice that I certainly didn't feel. "Liv," he replied, his tone artificially casual, though I could detect the tension underneath. "Just checking in. How's your day going?" "Busy but productive," I said truthfully. "Yours?" "Some frustrating administrative holdups," he said. "Nothing serious. Listen, I need to access some funds from my personal account for a business opportunity, but Diana's being unusually rigid about transfer protocols. Could you give her a call? Smooth things over? She's always responded well to your feminine touch." The patronizing request, asking me to use my feminine touch to help him steal his own money before divorcing me, would have been comical if it weren't so insulting. "I'd be happy to," I lied. "But Diana's quite meticulous about regulations. What's this business opportunity? Maybe I can help explain its time sensitivity." A moment of hesitation. "It's complex, Liv. Investment-grade diamonds through a private broker. Significant potential upside. But the window is closing quickly." Investment-grade diamonds. The engagement ring for Vanessa, perhaps. Or simply a convenient explanation for withdrawing large sums that could be easily transported and later liquidated outside normal banking channels. "Sounds fascinating," I said. "You know, I was just reading an article about diamond investments in The Economist. The authentication and certification processes are so important in that market." "Exactly," James agreed, seemingly relieved that I was accepting his explanation without question. "That's why timing is crucial here. The seller has all documentation in order, but other buyers are circling." "I understand completely," I assured him. "I'll call Diana right away." "You're the best, Liv," he said, his voice warming with apparent affection. "This is why we work so well together. You always support my vision." The casual gaslighting, reframing his attempted theft of marital assets as visionary business acumen, and my supposed intervention as wifely support, crystallized everything wrong with our marriage. For 15 years, James had systematically diminished my intelligence while exploiting it, praised my supportiveness while taking advantage of it, and claimed to value our partnership while secretly planning to discard it. "Happy to help," I replied, matching his warmth with practiced ease. "Oh, and James? Don't forget we have the Bransford Foundation Gala next Thursday. Your tuxedo is back from the cleaners." "Wouldn't miss it," he assured me, another casual lie to add to the collection. After ending the call, I immediately phoned Diana. "James may call you again about the transfer. Tell him the compliance team has flagged it for additional review due to the destination account's regulatory status. The process will take at least 5 more business days." "He won't be happy," Diana observed. "No," I agreed, "but his displeasure is not our primary concern." By evening, I had completed preparations for the next day's trust committee meeting and compiled comprehensive documentation of James's financial deceptions. I decided to spend the night at my downtown apartment rather than returning to the Beacon Hill townhouse. The confrontation with James was inevitable, but I wanted it to occur on my terms, with all pieces in place. I texted James, "Working late? On charity gala preparations with the committee. Staying at Catherine's tonight since we're still planning in the morning. See you tomorrow evening." His reply came quickly. "No problem. I have late meetings anyway. Love you." Catherine Blake was a mutual friend whose guest room I had occasionally used when charity events ran late, a convenient and believable alibi. In reality, I had maintained the downtown apartment for 5 years, purchased through one of my separate investment entities and unknown to James. It was my private sanctuary, designed entirely to my taste without concession to his preferences. Modern, minimal, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. As I poured a glass of wine and settled onto the window seat to watch the evening lights reflect on the water, I mentally rehearsed the trust committee meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Richard would be there, along with Ellen, whose unexpected involvement intrigued me. Edward Hayes would present the legal documentation. Diana would provide financial verification, and I would finally step fully into my role as the true manager of the Blackwood Trust, no longer hidden behind proxies and discretion. My phone chimed with an email notification from Megan. Additional information about Vanessa Reeves had been uploaded to my secure server. I opened the files to find something unexpected. Police reports dated 3 years ago, coinciding with Thomas Hawthorne's death. Vanessa had filed harassment complaints against Thomas 2 weeks before his suicide, claiming threatening behavior following their breakup. The timing seemed calculated to destroy his reputation, just as his financial improprieties were becoming public. More disturbingly, financial records showed transfers from an offshore account connected to James directly to Vanessa during this same period. Payments that continued monthly for nearly a year after Thomas's death before abruptly stopping. The implications were staggering. Had James and Vanessa conspired against Thomas? Had their current relationship actually begun years ago, perhaps, even before Thomas's engagement to her? And most troublingly, had they played some more direct role in the circumstances surrounding his death? I closed the files, suddenly exhausted by the compounding revelations. Each layer of deception peeled back only revealed darker truths beneath. The James Blackwood I had married, ambitious but principled, driven but compassionate, seemed increasingly like a carefully constructed fiction. The real man behind that facade was someone I barely recognized, capable of betraying not just his wife, but his closest friend. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and change. The trust committee meeting would establish new protective protocols. Ellen Blackwood would share whatever information she had about Vanessa. And I would finally begin the process of reclaiming not just my financial security, but my identity. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with an unexpected text from a number I didn't recognize. "You should know what your husband is really planning. Meet me at the Harbor Cafe tomorrow, 7 a.m. Come alone. V." Vanessa Reeves was reaching out directly. The development was surprising, but not entirely unexpected. In complex deceptions involving multiple parties, alliance shifts were common as self-interest dictated new strategies. The question was whether this represented a genuine attempt to share information or a trap designed to complicate my carefully constructed plans. Either way, I decided it was worth the risk to hear what she had to say. I composed a simple reply. "I'll be there." Setting my phone aside, I gazed out at the harbor lights once more. For 15 years, I had lived a double life. The supportive, financially naive wife in public, the shrewd, powerful financial strategist in private. Tomorrow, those separate selves would finally merge into one unified truth. James had underestimated me, dismissed me, and planned to discard me, all while benefiting from my intelligence and expertise. His discovery that I controlled the trust fund he believed would cushion his new life would be just the beginning of his education about the woman he had so grievously misjudged. Harbor Cafe opened at 6 a.m., catering to the early-rising financial district crowd. By 7, it was already half full with suited professionals clutching coffee cups and scrolling through morning market reports on their phones. I arrived at 6:45, selecting a corner table with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the emergency exit, a precaution that felt necessary given the increasingly complex web I was navigating. The waitress had just delivered my second espresso when Vanessa Reeves walked through the door. In person, she was more striking than her photographs suggested, tall and lithe, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being watched. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her makeup subtle but flawless. She wore an understated gray dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, accessorized with a single strand of pearls. "No engagement ring," I noted immediately. Interesting. Her eyes scanned the cafe until they landed on me. Recognition flickered across her features, though we had never formally met. James had carefully kept his world separate, never bringing Vanessa to events where I might be present. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said as she approached my table, her voice carrying the faint remnants of a southern accent beneath careful elocution. "Thank you for coming." "Ms. Reeves," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Or do you prefer Reynolds? Or perhaps another name entirely?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face before her composure returned. "You've been doing your research. Wouldn't you in my position?" She nodded slightly, settling into the chair with practiced grace. "I suppose I would." The waitress appeared, and Vanessa ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. When we were alone again, she leaned forward slightly. "I imagine you're wondering why I contacted you." "The thought crossed my mind," I acknowledged, "along with several theories about your motivation." "Such as?" "Perhaps James is becoming a liability. Perhaps you've found a more lucrative prospect. Or perhaps this is an elaborate setup orchestrated by both of you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "All reasonable theories, but incorrect." She paused as the waitress delivered her coffee. "I contacted you because you're in danger." Of all the openings I had anticipated, this wasn't among them. Physical danger? Financial, legal, and potentially physical, yes. She sipped her coffee, maintaining steady eye contact over the rim of the cup. "James isn't who you think he is." I couldn't help but laugh, a short, surprised sound. "That's quite an assertion coming from his mistress." "I'm not his mistress," Vanessa replied, setting down her cup. "I'm his accomplice. Or more accurately, I was supposed to be." My amusement faded as I processed her words. "Explain." "You're aware of my previous connection to Thomas Hawthorne?" I nodded. "What you may not know is that Thomas discovered financial irregularities in accounts he managed jointly with James, irregularities that implicated James in systematic misappropriation of client funds. When Thomas confronted him, James suggested a solution. Thomas would take public responsibility for the discrepancies, temporarily damaging his reputation, but protecting both their futures. James promised to quietly restore the funds over time, allowing Thomas to make restitution and eventually rebuild his standing. But that's not what happened, I surmised. No. Instead, James constructed an elaborate paper trail, ensuring that all evidence pointed exclusively to Thomas. Then he positioned himself as an unknowing victim of his friend's deception. Thomas realized too late that he'd been set up to take the complete fall. I processed this information, comparing it against what I already knew about Thomas's downfall. Where do you fit into this scenario? Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingernails tapped once against the porcelain cup. I was dating Thomas when all this began. James approached me privately, claimed Thomas was embezzling client funds, including money from the Blackwood Trust. He offered me a deal: help gather evidence against Thomas, and he would ensure I was protected financially. You betrayed your fiancé based solely on James's word? My skepticism was evident. I betrayed my fiancé because James showed me convincing documentation of Thomas's supposed crimes. Documentation I later realized had been fabricated. By then, it was too late. Thomas was destroyed professionally, our engagement was over, and her voice trailed off, took his own life, I finished quietly. She nodded, an unexpected flash of genuine pain crossing her features. After Thomas died, James made it clear that I was implicated in everything. The evidence he'd manipulated me into gathering could easily be reframed as active participation in the fraud. If I wanted to avoid potential criminal charges, I would continue to assist him with other financial arrangements. Blackmail, I said flatly. Insurance, she corrected. At least that's how James framed it. For 3 years, I helped him with various financial schemes, nothing explicitly illegal but ethically dubious. Setting up meetings with potential investors, providing introductions to wealthy individuals, occasionally entertaining clients who appreciated female company. And now? I prompted when she paused. 6 months ago, James approached me with a new proposition. He explained that he was planning to divorce his financially naive wife, his words, not mine, and needed to secure assets beforehand to avoid losing them in the settlement. The clinical description of James's betrayal stung, despite everything I already knew. So, you agreed to help him hide marital assets while simultaneously beginning a romantic relationship? The romantic relationship is theater, Vanessa replied bluntly. James needed a convincing reason for certain expenditures and behavioral changes. A midlife crisis affair with a younger woman provided the perfect cover for his asset relocation strategy. I considered her words carefully, searching for deception. If this is true, why tell me now? Because James's plans have evolved beyond financial manipulation. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small recording device. 2 nights ago, he had a private meeting with an individual whose background suggests connections to less than legitimate financial operations. I recorded their conversation. She pressed play, and James's voice filled the space between us. Ensure there are no complications. The trust represents significant assets, but accessing them requires eliminating certain obstacles. The primary obstacle being my wife. An unfamiliar male voice responded, "Accidents happen to wealthy women every day. Tragic, but not suspicious if handled correctly." The recording continued with a clinical discussion of potential scenarios: a car accident, a home invasion gone wrong, a sailing mishap during an upcoming vacation. James and his companion discussed each option with the detached interest of project managers evaluating implementation strategies. I felt physically ill as the recording ended, my hands gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. He's planning to kill me. He's exploring options, Vanessa corrected carefully. But yes, that appears to be the direction he's moving toward. The trust structure apparently presents obstacles he hadn't anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very mechanisms I had helped Richard implement to protect the family wealth from James's reckless investments were now the reason he was contemplating more permanent solutions to gaining control. "Why are you sharing this with me?" I asked, studying her face for clues to her true motivation. "You could have taken this recording to the police." "A recording obtained illegally from a private residence would be inadmissible in court," she pointed out. "And without other evidence, it becomes my word against his, the word of a woman with a documented history of financial impropriety, against that of a respected Boston financial advisor from a prominent family. Her assessment wasn't wrong. That still doesn't explain why you're helping me." Vanessa's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing something unexpected, genuine fear. "Because I've seen what happens to people who become inconvenient to James Blackwood. Thomas was just the first. There have been others whose careers, reputations, or lives were destroyed when they were no longer useful to him." "You're afraid?" "You're next," I realized. "I've outlived my usefulness," she confirmed. "The engagement ring, the promises of a future together, they're part of the final act. Once I've served my purpose in his divorce strategy, I have no illusions about my fate." I sat back, reassessing everything I thought I knew about the situation. If Vanessa was telling the truth, and the recording certainly supported her claims, then James's betrayal extended far beyond our marriage or finances. He was a sociopath capable of orchestrating his friend's suicide and contemplating his wife's murder. "I need the original recording," I said finally. Vanessa slid the device across the table. "It's yours. I have a backup secured with my attorney, with instructions to release it if anything happens to me." "Smart," I acknowledged. "What else do you have?" "Financial records documenting transfers. James directed me to manage. Accounts, dates, amounts. Correspondence regarding the apartment lease and other arrangements designed to create the appearance of an affair. And witness testimony about his activities surrounding Thomas Hawthorne's final days." "You've been planning this for some time," I observed. "Self-preservation," she replied simply. "I started collecting evidence the day I realized what had really happened to Thomas. I studied her carefully, still uncertain whether to fully trust her account." "What do you want from me?" "Protection," she said without hesitation. "I'll provide everything I have that incriminates James, in exchange for your guarantee that I won't be targeted in whatever legal proceedings result from this situation. You participated in defrauding me of substantial marital assets," I pointed out. "I participated in creating a paper trail that actually preserves your claims to those assets," she countered. "Every transaction is documented, every transfer traceable. Without my careful record-keeping, much of that money would have disappeared into truly untraceable channels." She had a point. If her documentation was as comprehensive as she claimed, it would substantially strengthen my position in divorce proceedings and potential criminal complaints against James. "I need time to verify your information," I said finally. "You don't have much time," Vanessa warned. "The fact that James is discussing elimination strategies means he's moving to the final phase of his plan." "I have a trust committee meeting this morning," I told her. "Depending on what happens there, I may need to accelerate my response." She nodded, sliding a thumb drive across the table. "Everything I mentioned is here. Names, dates, account numbers, correspondence. My contact information is included. A secure number, not the one James knows about." As she stood to leave, I asked one final question. "Was any of it real? Between you and James?" A bitter smile touched her lips. "Is anything real with James? He's been performing his entire life. Devoted son, loyal friend, brilliant financier, loving husband. None of those personas reflect who he actually is." After she departed, I remained at the table, attempting to process everything I'd learned. If even half of Vanessa's claims were true, I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a cheating spouse or financial fraudster. The recording suggested a man capable of contemplating murder to achieve his financial goals. I took a final sip of now cold espresso and texted Megan, "Need complete background on James's movements and contacts over past week. Priority focus on meetings with non-financial individuals. Also, security review of townhouse and my apartment immediately." Her response came quickly. "On it." Also, Ellen Blackwood called. "Wants to meet before committee. Says it's urgent." The trust committee meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the discreet Back Bay offices maintained for Blackwood family business, separate from the more public Blackwood financial headquarters downtown. Ellen had requested we meet privately at 9:15, giving us 45 minutes before the others would arrive. I arrived early, at 9 AUF, to review my presentation materials and ensure everything was in order. The conference room was elegant but understated. Leather chairs surrounding a mahogany table, abstract paintings on the walls, windows overlooking the Charles River. This space had hosted Blackwood family financial discussions for 3 generations, though I doubted any had been quite as consequential as today's would be. Ellen arrived precisely at 9:15, dressed in a navy suit that complemented her silver hair. At 74, she maintained the upright posture and direct gaze that had intimidated Boston society for decades. Our relationship had always been cordial, but distant. She had accepted me as James's choice without ever fully embracing me as family. "Olivia," she greeted me, setting her handbag on the table. "Thank you for meeting early." "Of course," I replied, noting that she seemed uncharacteristically tense. "Richard mentioned you had information about Vanessa Reeves." "Yes, though I knew her as Vanessa Reynolds." Ellen sat across from me, folding her hands precisely on the table. She was briefly engaged to Thomas Hawthorne, who was like a second son to us. "I've recently learned about that connection," I acknowledged. Ellen studied me carefully. "What exactly do you know about Thomas's death?" "I know he was implicated in financial improprieties, lost everything, and ultimately took his own life," I said, deciding transparency was the best approach. "And I have reason to believe James may have been involved in those events in ways that haven't been publicly disclosed." She nodded, a flash of pain crossing her features. "Thomas came to me 3 days before his death. He was distraught, claiming James had orchestrated his financial ruin. I dismissed his accusations as paranoia resulting from stress. He had documentation, but I refused to examine it. I told him to get help, that he wasn't thinking clearly. The confession clearly cost her emotionally, her usual composure cracking to reveal deep regret. "What happened to the documentation?" I asked gently. "After his death, I went to his apartment. The financial records were gone, but he'd left a letter addressed to me." She opened her handbag and withdrew an envelope, aged and slightly worn, at the edges. "I've never shown this to anyone, not even Richard. I've been too ashamed of my initial dismissal of Thomas's claims." She handed me the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 3 days before Thomas's suicide. "Ellen, I understand why you wouldn't look at the financial records yesterday. Loyalty to family is your defining characteristic, and I was asking you to consider something unthinkable. But what I told you is true. James systematically diverted client funds, then manipulated evidence to implicate me exclusively. I've discovered that Vanessa was helping him, collecting information, copying documents, reporting my movements. The woman I intended to marry was working with James to destroy me. I still don't understand why. By the time you read this, I will likely have taken steps that cannot be undone. I've lost everything, my reputation, my livelihood, my future. But I wanted someone to know the truth, especially if James targets others in the future. The documentation I showed you has been secured with someone I trust. If necessary, contact Martin Weber at Cambridge Trust. He has instructions to release everything under specific circumstances. I'm sorry to put this burden on you. Your family has been like my own, which makes this betrayal all the more painful. Thomas, I looked up from the letter to find Ellen watching me intently. Did you contact Martin Weber? No, she admitted. I convinced myself that Thomas had been mentally unstable, that his accusations were delusions born of desperation. It was easier to believe that than to consider that James, who Richard and I had raised to uphold the highest standards of integrity, could have done something so monstrous. And now? I asked. Now I find myself facing similar claims about my son, she said quietly. Richard has shared your discoveries regarding James's financial activities and apparent betrayal of your marriage. When he mentioned Vanessa Reeves had reappeared in James's life, I could no longer ignore the pattern. I carefully folded Thomas's letter and returned it to its envelope. Have you told Richard about this? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first to understand how it connects to what you've uncovered. I made a decision that felt both risky and necessary. Ellen, I met with Vanessa Reeves this morning. She provided evidence suggesting James coerced her into helping frame Thomas by convincing her Thomas was the actual fraudster. She claims she's been under James's control ever since, and recently has been helping him hide marital assets in preparation for divorcing me. Ellen's expression remained composed, though her knuckles whitened as she clasped her hands more tightly. You believe her? I'm verifying her claims, I replied carefully. But she provided a recording that suggests James is contemplating more extreme measures to gain control of assets he can't currently access. What kind of measures? I hesitated, then decided complete honesty was necessary. The kind that would result in my permanent removal from the equation. Ellen closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the implication. When she opened them again, her gaze was steely with resolve. Martin Weber still works at Cambridge Trust. I checked last night after speaking with Richard. The trust committee meeting was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. We need to contact him immediately. Already done, Ellen replied. I called him this morning. He's bringing everything to the committee meeting. I stared at her in surprise. You arranged this without telling me? I arranged it without telling anyone, she corrected. Some mistakes cannot be remedied, Olivia. I cannot bring Thomas back, but I can ensure that no one else suffers because of my willful blindness. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan. Urgent. J withdrawal attempt escalating. Diana being pressured by senior management at bank. Need immediate intervention. I showed the message to Ellen. James is attempting to liquidate his personal investment accounts despite compliance holds. Ellen's expression hardened. Which institution? Atlantic Trust. Diana Palmer is our contact there. Ellen reached for her phone. Lawrence Gilmore is the CEO. He and Richard have been friends for 40 years. She dialed, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, her tone became pure steel. Lawrence Ellen Blackwood, I need you to personally review all transaction requests from my son James immediately. Yes, it's exactly as serious as it sounds. No, Richard isn't available at the moment, but he will be calling you directly after our family meeting concludes. Thank you, Lawrence. I appreciate your discretion. She ended the call, meeting my gaze directly. That should buy us some time. Atlantic Trust won't process anything without multiple reviews now. I found myself reassessing Ellen Blackwood entirely. Beneath her socialite exterior lay a formidable woman who understood power and wasn't afraid to wield it when necessary. Thank you. She nodded once. All business now. We have 12 minutes before the others arrive. Tell me exactly what you've discovered about James's financial activities and what you intend to propose to the trust committee. For the next 10 minutes, I provided a concise summary of everything I had uncovered about James's systematic draining of our joint accounts, his apparent preparation for divorce, and the concerning patterns connecting back to Thomas Hawthorne's situation. I outlined my proposal to implement additional safeguards for the Blackwood Trust, requiring multiple independent verifications for any significant transactions. Ellen listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. When I finished, she studied me with new appreciation. "Richard told me you were managing the trust behind the scenes, but I had no idea how comprehensive. Your oversight has been. James has severely underestimated you." "Most people do," I replied simply. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Not after today, I suspect." The conference room door opened, and Richard entered, followed by Edward. "Hayes and Diana Palmer?" Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Ellen and me already deep in conversation, but he made no comment as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Before we begin," Ellen said, addressing the group, "we're expecting one additional attendee. Martin Weber from Cambridge Trust will be joining us with relevant documentation." Richard turned to his wife in surprise. "Martin Weber? Ellen, what's this about?" "It's about Thomas Hawthorne," she replied quietly. "And information that should have been brought to light 3 years ago." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as the implications of her statement registered with each person present. Richard's expression darkened with concern, while Edward Hayes began shuffling through his papers as if searching for documentation relevant to this unexpected development. Diana leaned toward me, speaking in a low voice. "There's been another development. James attempted to access the trust directly this morning, claiming you had authorized him to oversee investments during your absence." My alarm must have shown on my face because she quickly added, "The request was denied, of course. Our protocols require your direct verification for any such change, but his persistence is escalating." The door opened again, and Martin Weber entered, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and a serious demeanor. He carried a weathered leather briefcase that he placed carefully on the conference table. "Mrs. Blackwood." He nodded to Ellen. "It's been some time." "Too long, Martin," she replied. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." When you mentioned Thomas's name, I knew it was time. He opened the briefcase and removed a sealed envelope along with the external hard drive. Thomas left these in my care 3 days before his death, with specific instructions. They were to be released only if certain conditions were met, specifically if James Blackwood's financial activities came under formal scrutiny, or if Ellen Blackwood personally requested them. Richard looked between his wife and Martin, confusion evident. "Ellen, what is this about?" Ellen's composure remained intact, though I could see the emotional toll this was taking. "Thomas came to me before his death, Richard. He claimed James had framed him for financial improprieties that James himself had orchestrated. I didn't believe him. I refused to even look at his evidence." Her voice wavered slightly. "That may be the greatest regret of my life." The gravity of her statement settled over the room as Martin Weber placed the hard drive on the table. "This contains comprehensive financial records documenting systematic fraud spanning approximately 18 months. Thomas meticulously backtracked the transactions after becoming suspicious. The evidence suggests James Blackwood diverted client funds, then created a paper trail implicating Thomas exclusively." "That's an extraordinary accusation," Edward Hayes said carefully. "What verification exists that these records are authentic?" "Thomas anticipated that question," Martin replied, opening the sealed envelope. "Inside is a sworn affidavit from Thomas, along with authentication from a forensic accountant who verified the records before they were sealed. Also included are original bank documents with transaction timestamps and authorization codes." As the implications of this new information rippled through the room, I maintained careful observation of each person's reaction. Richard appeared genuinely shocked, his face paling as he processed the possibility that his son had engineered his best friend's destruction. Edward Hayes was already thinking like an attorney, his expression calculating as he considered the potential legal ramifications. Diana seemed unsurprised. She had likely harbored suspicions about James's activities for some time. "In light of these revelations," I said, breaking the stunned silence, "and the evidence I've compiled regarding James's current financial activities, I believe we need to take immediate action to secure the Blackwood Trust assets." Richard nodded slowly, still visibly processing the shock. "What do you propose, Olivia?" "First, immediate suspension of James's access to any trust information or assets pending full investigation. Second, implementation of enhanced security protocols requiring multiple independent verifications for any transactions above $10,000. Third, comprehensive audit of all trust activities for the past 5 years to identify any potentially compromised investments or irregularities." "I'll add a fourth measure," Ellen said, her voice steady once more. "Full cooperation with any legal investigations that may result from the disclosure of Thomas's evidence. The Blackwood family will not shield anyone from accountability, regardless of relationship." Richard reached for his wife's hand, an unexpected gesture of solidarity. "Agreed." Edward Hayes cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I should note that if these allegations against James prove accurate, there may be significant legal consequences extending beyond civil matters. Securities fraud, wire fraud, and potentially conspiracy charges could result." "We understand," Richard replied gravely. "But the Blackwood name has stood for integrity for 3 generations. We cannot preserve a reputation at the expense of justice." As the meeting continued with formal approval of my proposed security measures, my phone vibrated with another text from Megan. "Jay called office asking for you. Claimed financial emergency requiring immediate attention. Became agitated when told you were unavailable." James was clearly escalating his efforts as his financial maneuvers met with unexpected resistance. I excused myself briefly from the meeting to call Caroline. "We need to accelerate," I told her when she answered. "James is making increasingly desperate attempts to access funds. The situation is deteriorating faster than anticipated." "I've prepared emergency motions to freeze all joint assets," Caroline replied. "But I need your final authorization to file." I thought of the recording Vanessa had provided, James discussing potential scenarios for my elimination. If his financial escape routes were being systematically blocked, his desperation might drive him toward those more extreme options sooner than planned. "File immediately," I instructed. "And Caroline? Include the evidence regarding Thomas Hawthorne in the documentation. This goes beyond divorce proceedings now." "Understood. I'll have everything filed within the hour. Are you somewhere safe?" I'm at the Blackwood family offices with Richard and Ellen. James wouldn't attempt anything here. "Stay there until I confirm the emergency orders are in place," she advised. "Given what you've shared, we shouldn't underestimate what he might do when cornered." When I returned to the conference room, the committee was reviewing the authentication details of Thomas's financial records. Martin Bieber had connected the hard drive to the conference room's secure computer system, displaying transaction logs that painted a damning picture of James's systematic fraud. "These transfers correspond exactly with the irregularities I discovered in the trust's historical records," Diana observed, pointing to specific entries. "I flagged them during my review last year, but there was insufficient documentation to determine their origin." "Because James had created parallel transaction records implicating Thomas," Martin explained. "The actual money movements were masked through intermediary accounts before reaching their final destinations." My phone buzzed with a call from Megan, unusual during a meeting she knew was critically important. I excused myself again to answer. "James just arrived at your downtown office," she said without preamble, her voice tense. "He's demanding to see you, becoming increasingly hostile. Security is monitoring, but he's refusing to leave." "Has he made any specific threats?" "Not explicitly, but his behavior is concerning. He keeps insisting there's a financial emergency requiring your immediate attention, that millions are at stake. The desperation was escalating exactly as I had feared. With his attempt to liquidate accounts blocked, his contingency plans foiled, and the trust safeguards being reinforced, James was running out of options. "Contact building security," I instructed. "Have them escort him from the premises. If he refuses, they should call the police." "Already done," Megan confirmed. "But there's something else. He mentioned Vanessa, said if I couldn't reach you, I should tell you that Vanessa isn't what she seems. He seemed to think that would get your attention. A warning or an attempt to sow doubt about Vanessa's revelations. Either way, it confirmed James knew or suspected we had communicated." "Thank you for handling this," I told Megan. "Stay safe and call the police immediately if his behavior escalates further." I returned to the meeting, my concern evidently visible on my face. "Problem?" Richard asked. "James is at my office demanding to see me. Security is handling the situation, but his behavior suggests increasing desperation." Ellen's expression hardened. "We should conclude our business quickly then. The formal implementation of these security measures is our priority." For the next 20 minutes, the committee methodically approved each of my proposed changes to the trust's management structure, officially documenting my role as primary manager and implementing the enhanced security protocols. Edward Hayes prepared the legal documentation for immediate execution, while Diana confirmed the financial controls were being activated across all relevant accounts and institutions. As we concluded, my phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Emergency orders granted. All joint accounts and assets frozen pending hearing. James being served with papers now." The final piece was in place. James would now discover that not only were his attempts to drain our joint assets legally blocked, but that I had comprehensive documentation of his financial deception stretching back years, including evidence connecting him to Thomas Hawthorne's downfall. "It's done," I told the committee. "Legal proceedings have been initiated to secure all marital assets." Richard nodded grimly. Then we moved to the next phase, determining the full extent of James's activities and the appropriate response. "I've authorized my attorneys to share all evidence with relevant regulatory and law enforcement agencies," I said. "This extends beyond our marriage or even the trust now." Ellen's expression reflected complicated emotions. Grief for what her son had done, resolve to see justice served, and perhaps a measure of respect for the daughter-in-law who had uncovered the truth she herself had once refused to face. "The Blackwood family stands with you, Olivia," she said formally. "Whatever consequences James faces, they are of his own making." As the meeting adjourned, my phone rang again. Megan once more. "James has left the building," she reported. "But there's something else you should know. The police just called our office asking for you. Vanessa Reeves was found unconscious in her apartment 30 minutes ago. Apparent overdose." The timing couldn't be coincidental. Had James discovered Vanessa's betrayal? Or had this been planned all along? Another loose end to be eliminated. "Is she alive?" I asked. "In critical condition at Boston Medical Center. The police want to speak with you because your business card was found in her apartment, marked urgent." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Vanessa had anticipated this possibility, leaving my contact information to ensure I would be notified if something happened to her. She had been preparing escape routes just as I had been. "Tell them I'll speak with them later today," I instructed. "And Megan? Implement our office security protocols. No one enters without advance authorization, especially James. And send someone to check on my downtown apartment immediately." As I ended the call, I found Richard and Ellen waiting for me near the elevators, concern evident on their faces. "Vanessa Reeves has been hospitalized with an apparent overdose," I explained. "Likely not a coincidence given this morning's developments." "You should stay with us tonight," Ellen said decisively. "The Cambridge house has security, and James doesn't have access." The offer surprised me. In 15 years of marriage, I had never been invited to stay at Richard and Ellen's private residence in Cambridge. The Blackwood family home was their sanctuary, rarely open to anyone outside their immediate circle. "Thank you," I accepted, recognizing both the practical wisdom and the symbolic significance of the invitation. "I need to meet with my attorneys first and speak with the police about Vanessa's situation." Richard nodded. "Edward will accompany you. We'll have security meet you at your attorney's office." As the elevator arrived, Ellen touched my arm lightly, a rare physical gesture from a woman who typically maintained careful personal space. "Olivia, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with James, you remain family to us. Your management of the trust, your integrity throughout this situation. These things matter more than legal definitions of relationship." The unexpected acknowledgement brought a lump to my throat. For 15 years, I had operated in the shadows of the Blackwood family, acknowledged but never fully embraced, valued for my contributions but never truly seen. Now, in the midst of crisis, I was finally being recognized not just as James's wife, but as a person of substance in my own right. "Thank you, Ellen," I replied simply. "That means more than you know." As we descended in the elevator, I thought about the path that had led to this moment. James had methodically drained our joint savings to fund his affair and prepare for a future without me, never suspecting that the wife he had so consistently underestimated had been silently managing the very trust fund he believed would sustain him after our divorce. The reckoning had begun, and whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Caroline's office hummed with focused energy as her team prepared documentation for the expanded legal proceedings against James. Police. Officers had come and gone, recording my statement regarding Vanessa Reeves and the evidence she had provided. A detective named Garcia had listened carefully to the recording of James discussing potential elimination scenarios, her expression remaining professionally neutral even as the implications sank in. "We'll need the original recording for analysis," she had told me. "And we'll want to speak with Ms. Reeves when her condition stabilizes." "If her condition stabilizes," I had corrected quietly. According to the latest update from the hospital, Vanessa remained unconscious, her prognosis uncertain. Now, 6 hours after the trust committee meeting, I sat with Caroline reviewing the emergency motions a judge had granted that morning. "All joint accounts are frozen," Caroline confirmed, tapping a blue highlighted section of the court order. "James can't access any marital assets pending the preliminary hearing next week. We've also secured a temporary restraining order preventing him from entering the Beacon Hill townhouse or your downtown apartment." "What about the offshore accounts he's been establishing?" I asked. "More complicated," she admitted. "We've notified the relevant jurisdictions of potential fraudulent transfers, but international financial matters move slowly. That said, the emergency freeze should have stopped any transfers already in progress." My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Megan again. I excused myself to answer. "Two developments," she reported crisply. "First, the security sweep of your downtown apartment showed signs of attempted entry, scratches around the electronic lock mechanism. Nothing was breached, but someone definitely tried to gain access." A chill ran through me. "And the second development?" Diana Palmer called. "James tried to withdraw funds from his personal account an hour ago. When informed of the court order freezing all assets, he became verbally abusive. Security was called. He left, but not before threatening legal action against the bank and Diana personally. The walls were closing in on James, his financial escape routes systematically blocked. In my experience, desperate people rarely became less dangerous. Quite the opposite." "Has there been any direct contact from him?" I asked. 3 calls. To your office line, all sent to voicemail," Megan reported. "The messages escalate from demands to speak with you about this misunderstanding to accusations that you're destroying everything over a minor indiscretion. The third message was just obscenities. I winced, imagining the rage building in a man who had always prided himself on control and calculation. Forward the messages to Detective Garcia. They establish his state of mind. After ending the call, I returned to Caroline's office to find Edward Hayes had arrived. The elderly attorney had served the Blackwood family for decades, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the appearance of a distinguished professor, rather than one of Boston's most formidable legal minds. We've filed petitions in 3 jurisdictions to freeze international assets tied to accounts under James's control, he informed me without preamble. Richard and Ellen have provided personal affidavits supporting the claim that these transfers represent attempts to conceal marital and potentially trust assets. The swift, decisive action from my in-laws still surprised me, though I was increasingly recognizing that Ellen Blackwood possessed a steel core beneath her socialite exterior. "What's our next move?" I asked Caroline. "We wait for James to respond officially through counsel," she replied, gathering documents into a portfolio. "Based on the escalating pattern of his behavior, I expect that will happen within hours. Vincent Morgan is ambitious but not reckless. He'll advise James to proceed through proper legal channels." "And if James doesn't listen to that advice?" Edward asked, his tone suggesting he already anticipated the answer. Caroline's expression turned grave. "Then the restraining order becomes even more important. Olivia, you're staying at Richard and Ellen's tonight?" I nodded. "Their security team is waiting downstairs." "Good. I've also arranged for a private security detail to monitor your downtown apartment and office." She handed me a business card. The team leader's contact information. They're former law enforcement, extremely discreet, and very good at their jobs. The comprehensive precautions might have seemed excessive even a day ago. Now, with the recording of James discussing potential accidents and the attempted break-in at my apartment, they felt entirely necessary. Edward Hayes closed his briefcase with a decisive click. "I should return to Richard and Ellen. They'll want an update on these proceedings, and we need to prepare for potential regulatory inquiries once Thomas Hawthorne's evidence becomes part of the record." After he departed, Caroline walked me to the elevator. "A car is waiting for you in the underground garage," she said. "Take it directly to Cambridge. No stops, no detours." "You sound worried," I observed. "I've handled hundreds of high-net-worth divorces, Olivia. I've seen spouses do terrible things when millions are at stake." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I've rarely encountered someone as calculating as James appears to be. The premeditation evident in his financial maneuvers, the apparent connection to Thomas Hawthorne's situation, the recorded conversation about elimination strategies, these suggest someone who views people as pieces on a chessboard to be moved or removed as strategy dictates." "I lived with him for 15 years, I said quietly. "How did I miss this?" Caroline's expression softened slightly. "Because he wanted you to miss it. People like James excel at showing others exactly what they want them to see." The elevator arrived, and Caroline surprised me with a quick, fierce hug, uncharacteristic for my typically reserved friend. "Be careful," she murmured. "We're not just fighting for your financial security anymore." The ride to Cambridge took longer than usual, the Friday evening traffic clogging the routes out of Boston proper. I used the time to check email, confirmation that my personal accounts had been secured against unauthorized access, updates from Diana regarding the trust security implementations, a message from Detective Garcia requesting additional background information on James's recent activities. As we crossed the Harvard Bridge into Cambridge, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I wouldn't answer unknown calls, but given the day's events, I accepted the call cautiously. "Mrs. Blackwood?" A woman's voice, professional but with an undercurrent of urgency. "This is Dr. Renata Chapin from Boston Medical Center. I'm treating Vanessa Reeves." I sat straighter, signaling the driver to keep the privacy partition closed. "How is she?" "Stable, which is why I'm calling you." Ms. Reeves regained consciousness about 20 minutes ago. She's asking for you specifically and seems extremely agitated. She's insisting she needs to speak with you immediately. Did she say what about? Only that it's urgent and relates to your safety. The doctor hesitated. Mrs. Blackwood, while I can't discuss confidential medical details, I can tell you that Ms. Reeves's condition was not the result of a self-administered overdose. The toxicology findings suggest someone else was involved. The implications were clear and alarming. You're saying she was poisoned. I'm saying her medical presentation is consistent with unwitting ingestion of a specific combination of substances. The police have been notified. My mind raced. If Vanessa had been deliberately poisoned after meeting with me this morning, it reinforced everything she had told me about James's methods and willingness to eliminate complications. I need to speak with her, I decided. I'll come to the hospital immediately. I should warn you that the police are maintaining a presence here, Dr. Chapin said. They've stationed an officer outside her room given the suspicious circumstances. Good. I'll feel safer knowing they're there. I ended the call and directed the driver to change course for Boston Medical Center, then immediately called Richard to explain the situation. You shouldn't go alone, he said, after I explained Vanessa's condition and request. I'll send someone to meet you there. The police are already present, I reminded him. And time might be critical if Vanessa has information relevant to my safety. A brief silence, then. Ellen and I will meet you there ourselves. Don't enter the hospital until we arrive. The decisive response surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have given the day's revelations. Richard and Ellen were fully committed to addressing the situation, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about their son. Boston Medical Center's emergency entrance was brightly lit against the gathering dusk as our car pulled up 30 minutes later. I remained inside the vehicle as instructed, watching medical personnel and visitors come and go through the automatic doors. 15 minutes later, a black Bentley pulled alongside, and Richard and Ellen emerged, accompanied by a man I recognized as part of their household security team. Any update on her condition? Ellen asked as I joined them. Still stable, according to the last message from her doctor, I replied, noting that Ellen had changed from her committee meeting attire into something more casual, but still impeccably tailored. Even in crisis, appearances mattered in her world. The security team member led us through the emergency department to the elevator banks, his presence somehow clearing a path without obvious effort. We were met on the 4th floor by a uniformed police officer who checked our identification before allowing us to proceed to Vanessa's room. Dr. Chapin, a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and an air of efficient compassion, intercepted us in the hallway. Mrs. Blackwood, I should prepare you. Ms. Reeves is conscious but somewhat disoriented. We're still managing the after-effects of the substances in her system. Will speaking with her cause medical complications? Richard asked. The doctor glanced at him with momentary surprise, clearly recognizing the Blackwood patriarch. Brief conversation should be tolerated, but I'll need to monitor her condition throughout. Inside the hospital room, Vanessa looked alarmingly vulnerable. Her usual polished appearance replaced by pallor and the clinical accessories of serious medical intervention. An IV delivered fluids to her arm, while monitors tracked her vital signs with soft, rhythmic beeping. Olivia, she whispered when she saw me, her voice raw. You came. You asked for me, I replied simply, approaching the bed while Richard and Ellen remained near the doorway. Her gaze shifted beyond me, widening slightly at the sight of my in-laws. The Blackwoods. All of you. We're here because Olivia's safety may be at risk, Ellen said, her tone gentle but direct. The doctor said you have information. Vanessa's focus returned to me. James knows. About our meeting this morning. About the recording. He came to my apartment a few hours afterward. What happened? I asked, though the answer seemed evident given her current condition. He brought coffee, said we needed to discuss strategy. A bitter smile touched her pale lips. Always the gentleman, even when he's poisoning you. I only had a few sips before I realized something was wrong, but by then. She gestured weakly at the hospital room. Did he say anything specific? I prompted. About me or about his plans? He was angry, more than angry, enraged. He said you'd frozen the accounts, that you somehow knew everything. Her breathing quickened, the monitor registering the chandelier. He said the situation required immediate resolution, that loose ends needed to be eliminated. Me first, then you. Dr. Chapin moved forward, checking Vanessa's vitals with a concerned expression. We need to keep this brief. Her blood pressure is rising. Just a moment more, Vanessa insisted, her hand gripping mine with surprising strength. There's a storage unit at Cambridge Secure Storage, Unit 317. The access code is 428651. Everything is there. All the original documents, backups of communications, records of every transaction James directed me to manage. Her gaze intensified, including records related to Thomas Hawthorne. Ellen made a soft sound from the doorway, something between a gasp and a suppressed sob. Richard placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. He's going to come after you, Vanessa continued, her voice fading as fatigue overtook her. Not just legally. He can't afford to let you testify about what you know, the trust. It's his obsession. Has been for years. Dr. Chapin intervened firmly. That's enough for now. She needs rest. One last thing, Vanessa whispered as I prepared to leave. Check the files about the sailing accident 4 years ago. James's business partner. It wasn't an accident. The implication sent a chill through me. 4 years ago, James's business partner Gregory Willis had drowned during a weekend sailing trip. A tragic accident attributed to unexpected weather conditions and Willis's limited sailing experience. James had been devastated, publicly mourning. His friend, while privately absorbing Willis's stake in their joint ventures as stipulated in their business agreement. We'll look into everything, I assured her, gently withdrawing my hand from her grip. Rest now. The police will keep you safe. In the hallway outside, Richard, Ellen, and I gathered in a tight circle, processing Vanessa's alarming information. We need to contact Detective Garcia immediately, I said. Vanessa's statement about James poisoning her changes everything. This is now potentially attempted murder. And Gregory Willis, Ellen added, her expression haunted. If there's any possibility that wasn't an accident. First priority is securing Olivia's safety, Richard interjected firmly. Then we retrieve whatever evidence Vanessa has stored. Detective Garcia needs all of it. The poisoning, the Willis situation, Thomas's documentation, everything. We were interrupted by my phone ringing. Diana Palmer. James just showed up at the bank's executive offices, she reported without preamble, her voice tight with tension. He's demanding an emergency override of the account freeze, claiming you've fabricated allegations to gain financial advantage. He's threatening the bank with legal action and regulatory complaints if they don't release his funds immediately. Has he presented any documentation challenging the court order? I asked. None, just threats and demands. Our legal department is explaining that the freeze can only be lifted by judicial order, but he's becoming increasingly hostile. She paused. Olivia, he specifically mentioned knowing you're at Boston Medical Center right now. How would he know that? The question sent alarm racing through me. How indeed? We had taken precautions, used private transportation, made no public statements about our movements. Is security involved? I asked. They're monitoring the situation. He's still in the executive conference room with our legal counsel. Another pause. There's something else. He made a statement that concerned our chief security officer enough to report it immediately. He said, and I quote, "This will all be resolved by morning, one way or another." The thinly veiled threat confirmed my worst fears. James was accelerating his timeline, moving from calculated financial maneuvering to more direct action. Diana, please have security detain him if possible. At minimum, document everything he says. Already happening, she assured me. Be careful, Olivia. After ending the call, I briefed Richard and Ellen on this latest development. We need to leave. Immediately, Richard decided. If James knows you're here, this location isn't secure. As if to emphasize his point, the elevator at the end of the hall opened, and a hospital security officer approached rapidly, accompanied by the police officer who had been stationed at Vanessa's door. Mrs. Blackwood? The security officer called. We have a situation. A man claiming to be your husband is demanding access to this floor. He's becoming disruptive in the main lobby. James had arrived at the hospital. The timeline had compressed from hours to minutes. Is there another way out? Richard asked sharply. Service elevator at the end of the hall, the officer replied. I can escort you there while hospital security manages the situation downstairs. Ellen turned to the police officer. Ms. Reeves needs additional protection immediately. My son may intend her harm. The officer nodded grimly. Already calling for backup. We'll secure her room. We moved swiftly down the hallway toward the service elevator, the security officer leading the way while checking corridors and intersections before allowing us to proceed. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Garcia. At BMC responding, to disturbance. Your husband detained by security. Need to speak with you urgently. I showed the message to Richard. They have James downstairs. Temporarily, he replied. We still need to leave now. If they don't have grounds to arrest him, they'll have to release him soon. The service elevator arrived, its utilitarian interior a stark contrast to the hospital's public-facing spaces. As we descended to the loading dock level, Ellen took my hand in an unexpected gesture of support. This isn't your fault, she said quietly. None of us saw what James was truly capable of. The simple absolution released something tight in my chest, a knot of guilt I hadn't fully acknowledged. Had I somehow enabled James's behavior by playing into his expectations? By pretending to be less than I was for so many years? I maintained. The facade, I replied as the elevator reached its destination. I let him believe I was financially naive, professionally unambitious, content to live in his shadow. I thought I was being strategic, but maybe I just made it easier for him to underestimate me, to think he could discard me without consequences. You did what women have done for generations, Ellen said with unexpected insight. You adapted to survive in a world that rewards certain behaviors and punishes others. The difference is, you never surrendered your power. You just exercised it differently. The loading dock was quiet at this hour, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that cast multiple shadows as we moved quickly toward the waiting vehicles. Richard's security team had positioned cars at both the main entrance and this secondary exit, anticipating potential complications. As we reached the Bentley, my phone buzzed with another call from Detective Garcia. Mrs. Blackwood, she said. When I answered, we've detained your husband temporarily for creating a disturbance, but we'll have to release him soon without formal charges. However, based on Ms. Reeves's statement and preliminary toxicology results, we're seeking a warrant related to the suspected poisoning. That process will take several hours at minimum. He threatened me, I told her. Indirectly, but the intent was clear. Diana Palmer at Atlantic Trust can verify his statements. We're gathering that evidence now, Garcia confirmed. In the meantime, I strongly advise you to proceed to a secure location. If you have any reason to believe your husband might become violent, don't hesitate to call 911 immediately. After ending the call, I joined Richard and Ellen in the Bentley, our security detail following in a separate vehicle. As we pulled away from the hospital, I spotted James's Porsche parked haphazardly near the emergency entrance, evidence of his haste and agitation. "Where are we going?" I asked, noticing we weren't heading toward Cambridge. "Change of plans," Richard replied. "If James knows we're involved, he might anticipate us returning to Cambridge. We're going to our lake house in New Hampshire instead." The Blackwood Lake House was rarely mentioned, a secluded property on Lake Winnipesaukee that served as the family's most private retreat. I had visited only twice in 15 years of marriage, both times for brief summer gatherings. "We need to retrieve the evidence from Cambridge Secure Storage first," I reminded. "Himpus Edward is handling that," Ellen explained. "He's sending someone to collect everything from the storage unit and deliver it directly to Detective Garcia." My admiration for my in-laws' efficiency grew. Without drama or excessive discussion, they had pivoted to address each emerging threat, mobilizing resources and securing critical evidence. "There's something I don't understand," I said as we merged onto the highway heading north. "James has always been ambitious, calculating, even manipulative. But attempted murder? That's a profound escalation from financial fraud or marital infidelity." Richard and Ellen exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken communication, the kind that comes from decades of partnership. "There's context you should know," Richard said finally. "Context that may partially, though not remotely excuse, James's obsession with controlling the Blackwood Trust." Ellen continued, her voice steady despite the evident emotional toll. "When James was in college, my father, his maternal grandfather, died suddenly. He had been extraordinarily wealthy, but gambling and poor investments had decimated his fortune. James was devastated. He had idolized my father, expected to inherit significant wealth from him. Instead," Richard added, "the inheritance was minimal. The experience affected James profoundly. He became obsessed with financial security, with accumulating and controlling wealth. That doesn't explain his willingness to harm others," I pointed out. "No," Ellen agreed soberly. "But there were indicators we ignored. His competitive streak that sometimes crossed ethical lines, his inability to accept responsibility for failures, his tendency to discard relationships that no longer served his purposes." "The signs were there," Richard acknowledged, regret heavy in his voice. "Small at first, then larger. We rationalized them as ambition, as the necessary edge for success in finance. By the time the pattern became truly concerning, he was an adult with his own life, his own reputation. And then Thomas Hawthorne," Ellen added quietly. "You believed Thomas's allegations?" I asked, surprised. "Not at first," she admitted. "But afterward, I found myself reviewing countless incidents, reconsidering patterns of behavior I had dismissed. The doubt grew, though I never shared it with Richard until recently. The revelation of their private doubts, their gradual recognition, of their son's darker nature, was clearly painful for them both. I reached out, briefly touching Ellen's hand in a gesture of understanding. "We failed him," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "And by extension, we failed everyone he's harmed." "You didn't make his choices," I reminded them. "James is responsible for his own actions." The remainder of the drive passed in contemplative silence, each of us processing the day's revelations and their implications. By the time we reached the lake house, darkness had fully descended, the property illuminated only by motion-activated security lights that flared as our vehicles approached. The house was larger than I remembered, a sprawling cedar and stone structure overlooking the water, its walls of glass currently reflecting the car's headlights. Richard's security team did a perimeter check before allowing us to enter, confirming the property was secure. Inside, the great room's soaring ceiling and massive stone fireplace created an atmosphere of rustic luxury. Ellen moved efficiently through the space, turning on strategic lighting and adjusting the thermostat to counter the evening chill. "You should try to rest," she suggested, noting my evident exhaustion. "The West Wing guest suite is prepared. We'll maintain security, monitoring throughout the night." "I'm not sure I can sleep," I admitted. Too much has happened today. Nevertheless, you should try, Richard advised. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Legal proceedings, police investigations, trust oversight meetings. He was right. Of course. The crisis was far from resolved, despite the day's significant developments. James would be released from temporary detention soon if he hadn't been already. While the evidence against him was mounting, formal charges and legal consequences would take time to materialize. In the guest suite, I found my overnight bag had already been brought in, packed by Megan and retrieved from my office by Richard's staff while we were at the hospital. The level of coordination was impressive, reflecting the Blackwood family's resources and Richard's leadership. After a hot shower, I checked my phone to find multiple updates. Edward Hayes confirming that the contents of storage unit 317 had been secured and were being cataloged. Caroline reporting that Vincent Morgan had filed an emergency motion challenging the asset freeze, to be heard Monday morning. Megan providing security updates from my office and apartment buildings. No further attempted intrusions. And Detective Garcia confirming that James had been released from detention but was under surveillance pending potential arrest warrants. I sent brief acknowledgments to each message, then composed a more detailed email to Caroline outlining Vanessa's poisoning and the disturbing information about Gregory Willis's sailing accident. The potential pattern of eliminating inconvenient individuals upgraded our concerns from theoretical to concrete, changing the nature and urgency of both the divorce proceedings and potential criminal complaints. As I prepared for bed, a soft knock at the door announced Ellen, carrying a tea tray. "Chamomile with honey," she said, setting it on the bedside table. "My mother's remedy for troubled nights." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. Ellen hesitated, then sat on the edge of the armchair near the windows. "I owe you an apology, Olivia. For 15 years I've maintained a certain mere distance in our relationship. You don't need to—" She raised a hand to gently interrupt. "I do. I made assumptions about you when James first introduced us. I saw what he wanted me to see. A beautiful, accommodating woman who would support his ambitions without challenging his authority. I never bothered to look deeper, to question whether that surface impression reflected your true self. The frank admission surprised me. Most people saw what James wanted them to see. I deliberately cultivated that image." "Yes, but I should have known better," Ellen insisted. "I, of all people, understand the compromises women make in certain environments, the strategic concessions, the careful navigation of male egos and expectations. I've lived that reality for over 50 years in Boston society and the financial world. I studied her with new appreciation, recognizing that beneath her patrician exterior lay decades of similar experiences to my own. Different in specifics, perhaps, but familiar in essence. In any case," she continued, "I want you to know that I see you now. Not as James's wife or the manager of our family trust, but as Olivia, intelligent, strategic, resilient. Whatever happens with James, with the legal proceedings, with the trust, you have allies in Richard and me." The unexpected declaration of support brought a lump to my throat. "That means a great deal to me." Ellen nodded once, then rose. Gracefully. "Try to sleep. As Richard said, tomorrow will bring its own challenges." After she left, I sipped the chamomile tea and gazed out at the moonlight reflecting on the lake's surface. The day's events had transformed my life irrevocably, exposing James's true nature, establishing unexpected alliances, and setting in motion legal and financial consequences that would reverberate for years. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Cautiously, I opened it to find 4 words that sent a chill through me despite the room's comfortable warmth. "This isn't over. Not remotely." James had found a way to contact me despite the precautions, despite the restraining order, despite everything. Even now, he was calculating his next move, planning his counterattack. I forwarded the message to Detective Garcia with a brief note. From James, presumably. Unknown number. Then I set the phone aside and slipped between the cool sheets, knowing sleep would be elusive but recognizing the necessity of rest. Tomorrow would indeed bring new challenges. James would ensure that. But for the first time in our 15-year relationship, we would be facing each other without pretense or illusion. He now knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. And I finally understood who he truly was as well. The game had changed completely, the power dynamic fundamentally altered. James had used our life savings to fund his affair and plan his exit strategy, never imagining that his financially naive wife controlled the trust fund he believed would cushion his new life. That miscalculation would prove his undoing. 6. Months later, I stood at the podium in the elegant conference room of the newly established Caldwell Ethics Foundation, addressing its inaugural board meeting. The foundation's offices, ironically located just 2 floors below the Caldwell Group's headquarters, offered a spectacular view of Chicago's skyline. As we finalize our first grant recipients, I concluded, I want to thank everyone who helped transform a personal betrayal into something genuinely beneficial. My gaze swept across the assembled board members, Eleanor in her role as honorary chairperson, Arthur representing the original trustees, Veronica now pursuing her business degree while serving as community outreach coordinator, and yes, James, fulfilling his obligation with surprising dedication. The transformation in James over these months had been unexpected. Initially resentful of his required participation, he had gradually engaged with the Foundation's mission, his natural strategic abilities finding productive application in ethical business education rather than personal manipulation. After the Yacht meeting adjourned, James approached me as I gathered my materials. "The youth mentorship program was your idea, wasn't it?" he asked, nodding toward the presentation slides still displayed on the screen. "The concept, yes," I acknowledged. "The implementation has been largely Veronica's work." He nodded thoughtfully. "It's good. Better than anything I would have created with the inheritance if I'd received it as originally planned." The simple admission, perhaps the first completely honest statement he'd ever made to me, caught me off guard. "Thank you for saying that." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Grandfather would have preferred you as his heir, you know. Not his grandson's wife, his actual heir." Before I could respond, he continued toward the door where Eleanor waited, their weekly lunch appointment apparently next on his calendar. Cassandra joined me at the window as the room emptied. "Still find it strange to work with him?" she asked, watching James's retreating figure. "Less each time," I admitted. "The Foundation creates a different dynamic than our personal history." The afternoon sun glinted off my grandmother's pearls, now a daily reminder of her wisdom rather than occasional formal wear. Her words echoed in my mind. Never underestimate a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. What had begun as the most humiliating moment of my life, a mistress crashing my engagement party, had transformed into the catalyst for discovering my true worth beyond anyone else's valuation. Sometimes the most devastating moments create openings for our most authentic paths forward. In losing a fiancé, I had gained something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge of my own capacity to transform betrayal into purpose, manipulation into mission, and endings into more meaningful beginnings. Up next, you've got 2 more. Standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.